To get us started, Jessica, do you want to say a few words about why you wanted to do an exhibition about this?
Okay, yes. I'll stand, okay. Hi, everybody, thanks for coming. It's been a really surreal experience putting the show together. I initially started working on my project, Portraits of My Father, was because I was living in New York for about 13 years, and my dad was going through some health issues, and he asked me to return. And so I packed up my life and dismantled it and returned back to California. And so that was 2018, and I realized I had this window of time to kind of get closer to him and make up for lost time for all the time that was gone. And so I decided to just turn my camera on him and capture portraits of him, and hopefully, I know one day, he might not be with me, so I could rely on these portraits to help me remember. Yeah, and I also realized the whole time, I know he's getting older, so I'm like trying to prepare myself for the grief. So I think this photography was a way to kind of bring control back to like feelings and emotions that I had no control over. So I decided to make these portraits and just kind of have fun with it and capture things that are day-to-day life. And it was definitely a lot slower in California than New York. So, but it was, it's a different set of life circumstances, and I just embraced it and just spent time. And so it just got me thinking about just my dad, and he loves talking and telling stories. It's endless. Sometimes it's the most inopportune moments, like I'm working on something and he's like, just retell a story. And so I just have all these stories from him, and the most special ones for me were stories about my grandfather and grandmother who I never met. And so you can see the two shadow boxes I have. Those are all pictures from the family album, and they're just images that help me get to know them. I never met them. They did meet me as like a 1-year-old, but I didn't, clearly have no recollection. So yeah, so I was working on this project, and it just helped me appreciate my dad and kind of like the aging process, and just kind of preparing myself for what's to come. So that's what this portrait project for me was about. And so when Vince asked me to curate a show, he asked me what I was working on, and I talked to him about my portrait project. And I sort of kind of came up with, well, I know a lot of people are struggling with this. Like, I'm at the age now where we're dealing with, our parents no longer being with us. So how do you navigate life after the fact? But actually, as I went through this exhibition, I came across people that much younger than me that have lost their parents. So this exhibition has been just very emotional, but everyone who came together, really did the emotional work to put their projects together. So I'm really, really all proud of them. And so here we have Matthew, Najee, Stella, and Laura. And so you can see the work on the wall too. But yeah, that's how the start of it came about.
All right, and I think three of you, Jessica, Najee, and Matthew, have all sort of figured out a way to photograph family photographs, and you've all done it so differently. Do you think you three could touch on that a little bit, and like what your thought process was?
The way it started was my grandmother gave me a box of photos that were kind of ruined by water damage. The story changes every time I ask her what happened, but being the photographer in the family, she just swears that I could fix everything. So she gave me the bag, and I'm like, if I had the negatives to these, I probably could like reprint them, but she just said, well, just hold on to them. So they sat in my closet for the longest time, and then this project kind of was born out of wanting to understand the men in my family, and then I started looking at some of the images that were in my closet. Like, for some reason, I just was one day cleaning up, and I was like, oh, this is very interesting, and I called my dad, like, well, who are these people? What is this person? You're hugging some girl from prom? Well, who is this? Like, you know, and then from there, I just went back to grandma's house and got all of the photos, like every single photo album. She just has a giant tub of photos, and she was a lot better at keeping track of everything. Like, my dad has like just a giant basket of loose photos everywhere, which I preferred, because what ended up happening was I could just spread them out over a table and kind of collage and still life them in such a way where that I would interview each man in my family and ask them specific questions about like their lives and maybe things that I was around for, that maybe I was like 5 or 6, so I was there but I wasn't fully present. So now I'm going back and asking them questions about, well, what was it like having multiple kids from different marriages come together, and like how do you feel about that? And so as I started putting them all together, I was very conscious of like, well, how does my dad think about these things? How does my cousin think about some of these things? How does my uncle, and so on and so forth? And so I ended up laying them on a table, and I took a few like theater lights, and kind of, they're like, you know, you can make different shapes with them. They're called Lego lights. And so I ended up trying to focus on certain ideas or feelings or emotions that, even though they're telling me one story, I get to step back and actually look at the bigger picture and like what this means to them. And so I ended up just kind of like, you know, collaging. I thought they were collages. I've talked to somebody that says they're more like still lifes. I think they're a mixture of the two. But it is like, you know, there are like poems that I wrote when I was like 10. And how does that feeling communicate with like cousins and their self-esteem and things like that? And so that's kind of how it came about and what I was thinking about when I made the collages all together. But yeah.
For me, I would say there was a lot of piecing together with what photos I did have. It wasn't like I could go through a backlog of things and find photos to share a part of this that didn't involve my sisters, because my parents, and for them, there aren't a whole lot of photos in the family. So it was a lot of piecing together. And when I had read the review about this exhibition, the writer had wrote that I had an eclectic mix of things. And I was thinking that as I was making it, but I feel like it was forced to be that way because I had to piece together identity, information, and all these thoughts going on. And I also went to Vietnam earlier in this year, and I feel like that was a big inspiration to some of the photos used because it was such a culture shock going over there for the first time ever. There was a language barrier. There's all these thoughts in my head about what it means to be Vietnamese, what it is to be American in a way. And I came back feeling more Vietnamese, like thinking like, yeah, I want to be Buddhist and I want to do the things my mom did, and I want to learn how to set the altar and so on and so forth. But part of me kind of snapped out of that and realized that, well, I was born here and I am who I am. I'm a mix of both my own identity and the things that my parents would have wanted me to be. And I feel like that was the biggest inspiration behind the collage that I did. It was me figuring out what my spiritual beliefs are and what I lean towards. And I have memories of growing up in Oakland, and as a kid I would go to a Sunday school that had church afterwards. And my mom thought it would have been good for me to try to be Catholic like my dad, but of course she would only drop me off in the parking lot and go about her day. So without her there to really enforce it on me, I would go home and see her at the altar practicing her Vietnamese traditions. And without my dad here, I didn't have more support to go in the way of Catholicism. So I was really trying to figure out what my beliefs are and what influenced it, and piecing it all together, like how I was piecing together the collage. It came by piece, trying to make sense of it. And it was inspired by a lot of writings, the work that is by writings, authors, that I've been diving into that are Vietnamese as well. So it feels like a constant trying to figure out who I am. And the show and the trip earlier this year, it all just lined up to allow me to put this work together.
So, yeah, the albums that I had from my father, they were also kind of just scattered about, and you know, my dad doesn't have the memory he used to have, so I sort of had to rely on the visuals of the photographs to piece together, you know, where my grandparents were in the photo, and you know, it was just, there was not much to go on. There was some markings, some dates and times, but I had to piece together the story that I remembered my dad telling me. But the significant development that happened recently was getting back in touch with my father's brother. So he's the twin brother in the photos there, after 30 years. And we were helping him move to an assisted living situation. So we had some of his boxes, and in those boxes was family albums, pictures that I hadn't seen, but he was way more organized than my dad. It was beautiful the way he pieced together the albums, and he did it in a chronological, like it filled so many pieces of the puzzle that was missing in my mind of how our family story and family history was, you know, being told. And so some of these images are from my uncle's photo albums that he put together of the family. And so I hadn't seen them in over 30 years. And so he's a part of this exhibition too, in that sense. But he's actually the artist in his family. So he's a painter, and he actually also is a photographer. So it made me realize, oh, he knew how to arrange these photos and tell a story. And yeah, without him and his organization, and I wouldn't be able to put these photos in the show the way I did. So yeah, that's how it sort of came about.
And then Laura, your pieces have really beautiful interviews involved with them, and I feel like a lot of times photography goes really well with interviews and like with telling portraiture is often telling other people's stories, and sometimes you don't really get that additional element. Do you mind expanding on why you wanted to include the actual audio of each person? Sure.
Just going to tackle you guys in space. Yeah, there are at least a couple of reasons why I chose to have audio in the with the portraits. The first is that I took a documentary, or I took a workshop with the photographer Diana Marcosian, and she introduced this concept of collaborative documentary photography, which is basically bringing the subject or the person that you're photographing into the process of producing your work. And so she actually sent us out on an assignment where we had to go photograph or meet some stranger and photograph them, but then record the whole process from meeting them to the interaction, and you know, how do you want to pose, and you know, will you allow me to take your picture, and then finally the close and the goodbye. And that was really interesting to me because the idea of bringing somebody in, you know, I wanted it to, my processes from that point on to be more two-sided and not so transactional. And so that opened up sort of that sort of process for me. And so for myself, you know, I usually photograph documentary style, but in this series I did portraits, but I still wanted a documentary element to it, which is why I put the audio in there. And the audio is of each of the women that I'm photographing, describing who they are, what are they all about, what kind of life have they lived, and what's their future. And also, how do they want to be photographed? The other reason why I wanted to have audio is because of a more personal reason. So I wanted to be able to connect more with the elders in my family, but for various reasons, cultural barriers, language barriers, even being someone who identifies as American first and then Chinese, that I wasn't able to have that connection with them. And so I went to the people who were most accessible. So my mom, who had always been very encouraging of everything that I've done. She first volunteered herself, and then I went to my friend Susan, who's over here, who I met through a different artist organization, and she's a friend and artist herself and a collaborator, and then she introduced me to more people, and then other people came to me. And so I was able to have connection in that way, and that became even more important to me when 1 year after I took that portrait of my mother, she passed away suddenly. And the finality of all of that, every single, to play on the namesake of this exhibition, every story that she's told me was then the responsibility of myself to pass on to, my daughters. And so it was my story, her story became my story to tell.
And then Stella, I think what's really interesting is that your work is kind of the only work that doesn't have a lot of portraits in it. I'm really lucky because I got to see sort of all of the work that you had submitted, and I know there were more portraits in there. But do you mind expanding on why, when you had to select the 8, you only did the 1 portrait, and then the rest of the space?
First of all, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate being here this evening. Let me just tell you a little bit about the home of my grandma. So when I went home to the Philippines, it was just a mention from my mother that they were going to, raise the house, or basically tear it down. And fortunately, I had my camera with me, and so I said, well, I need to go over there and photograph it. So at that point, when I took those photographs, my grandfather had just passed 2 weeks ago, and then my grandmother had passed away several years prior to that. So this is sort of like, I would say, a portrait of them, the portrait I never took of them, but represented through their home, is basically what it is. So each photograph is sort of a portrait. It says something about a memory, or something that happened. It tells about, my grandmother would love the kitchen, so I thought that was part of her. The piano is, my mom played it, and my uncle. So there's just stories in there. And so I thought, how could I tell a story of a person that's no longer? And so through space, composition, through objects, that's how I was able to take a portrait of them.
And then Laura, I know you just said that your style is mostly documentary, but I think if the rest of you could kind of touch on what your sort of general photographic practice is like, I think that would be really great.
I would say mine is documentary as well, excluding the collage, which, like I said, had to be pieced together, had to be made from stories that I'd been told by my mom and my sisters about what my dad was and what he was like, and maybe what that would have been like if he was in my life. So yeah, I would say my style is documentary. With each photo in my series, there's not a particular time that they were taken. They're spread across a couple of years, some of them. And I would say some of them are pretty early when I started taking photos. And looking back on them, I had to think about what made me want to take them. And it was generally around the time of Vietnamese New Year. And it's such a spectacle to be able to photograph, and has always been a part of my life, but I knew it was something that I wouldn't be able to celebrate again as true to tradition as I could without my mom. So I felt like it was something that I had to preserve through photography. You know, photography sometimes is more like a tool of memory for me for a future's sake than it is for documentary or whatever other reason.
And would you say that that applies to your practice outside of this project as well? Or do you photograph a lot of other things outside of your project?
Yeah, I would say that's generally how I go about things in a documentary kind of approach. I think any photographer can't withdraw from photographing everything and anything that they find interesting and making sense of it later. So that was a lot of this too. It was preserving it and then making the meaning of it later, piecing it together. So.
Yeah, I think it's documentary as well. When I was a kid, my dad used to say, everybody wants to tell their story, you just have to give them opportunity to do so. And when I first got into photography, I did not want to photograph people. Like I didn't like photographing people. I didn't like people in general. But as time has gone on, like I just find myself more and more like gravitating to, especially if you want to tell me your story. Like I'm not much of a prober when it comes to talking to people. I would prefer for you to volunteer that information. I don't want to feel like I'm like intruding on anything. And so I am curious about people quite a bit, and I do enjoy when people start telling me about themselves. So as I've been outside of the project I have, you know, even if nobody wants to tell me their story, there is a general curiosity of like documenting who you are as a person. And it's been a fun process, and I think documentary.
For me, I think I want to describe my creative process as something that's evolving. I think it was Cheryl Stray that said something about, you know, you photograph and you have seasons in your life, and so there's an arc and up and down. So you photograph. My creative practice sort of follows that route of where my life leads me. So I did. When I started, I was a black and whitey. I did 15 years of documentary, fashion, you know, all that. And then I moved to color and did street photography. Still do when I can. And then lately I have been doing digital collages, which I started during the pandemic. And then lately also doing writing. I have a Substack newsletter. It's called Sundays with Stella. So if you guys want to follow, and that's where I write like finding meaning of life and through writing, photography, and collage. So.
Yeah. So, oh man, some people try to call me an artist, and I try to shy away from that because I would say I'm more of a creative practitioner. So I started out drawing a lot as a kid. Then as I got older, I discovered graphic design. So I was a graphic designer and web designer for 10 years. And then I decided I wanted to make films. And so I went to graduate school and studied documentary filmmaking. And then I got to work for Albert Maysles, who is one of the kind of the godfather of documentary filmmaking and cinema verite, which is kind of filming people in their natural environment and without interrupting what they're doing. So I kind of fell in love with that process, and all the while I always had a camera in my hand because I just loved photographing things around me. So I didn't take photography, I guess, seriously, I was always doing it for fun and not thinking too much about it. I just really wanted to preserve my joy and not really put a label on it. So I was working in documentary filmmaking for a while, but at the time everything was, I would say, advancing technologically just super fast. I couldn't even catch up because the equipment was so expensive and I just couldn't catch up. And then I decided I'm gonna shoot with film again, and with the most dinkiest camera I could find, and that ended up being a Diana F, which is a plastic camera. And you never know what's gonna happen in that camera because it's got light leaks, it's all experimental. But I started photographing again with that camera, and every time I turned in the film, it was like Christmas again. And it brought me so much joy, and so that became my impetus into photography, and all my previous careers led to being a documentarian, and so I just now gradually just kind of went into documentary photography. So I wasn't really into portraiture, but the project with my father has helped me kind of meld portraiture and documentary together. So I would say, yeah, I guess that's part of my documentary process in photography. Yeah.
Do you want to expand more about your practice? Or?
She kind of touched on it.
Yeah.
I kind of see that the documentary process is sort of like doing research now, which I'm not a scientist, so if anyone out there is, and you can correct me on the process, but you get this idea, and then it's generally you develop this hypothesis, and then you do all the research that you need to before you sort of actually dive into the research, which is taking the photographs, and then the photos are kind of like the data and everything that you sort of sort out at the end. And that has been a way for me to be a lot more methodical about my process. I kind of like mentally or internally, it's just sort of chaotic, but then this kind of provided this sort of structure for me. And so thinking about projects, documentary projects in that sort of way has helped me approach things and understand them a little bit better. So, yeah.
If you want to hang on to the mic, that's totally fine. But my last question before we give it to the audience, do you guys think that your project is done? I mean, I know we have kind of a limited view just because we're sort of limited on space. But is it something that you're still working on, sort of? Or is it something that you feel like you said what you needed to say? Are you taking a break? Like, how do you feel in the process of your project?
So I took these photos back in 2017, all of them, and did almost all of the interviews in that same year. And for me, I would say that it's done, but it's not. And maybe I won't speak for everybody, but else here on the panel. But I think, given the personal nature of the portraits, that the work is never going to be done. This sort of uncovering of family or personal histories or finding connection is always going to continue until you die, and then the survivors will pick up the stories that you have and continue it forward. But that said, my plan is to probably keep these photos where they are, and I'd like to move on to other documentary projects, but this has inspired me to work more in exploring personal work. Prior to this, I was shooting boxing and MCs and rooster fights and stuff like that, so it's photography has definitely put me in weird places, but the personal connection to those are not as strong as this, and so this has certainly encouraged me to explore and look deeper internally to stories that resonate. Because I think the stronger that you have a connection to the story that you're telling, the more that that's going to convey and resonate with others. And I also, but I do plan on bringing in some of the elements like also the personal aspect and recording audio. I really like that aspect of storytelling now.
Yeah, I want to reiterate what Laura said. I definitely feel the same way. I'm realizing because of this exhibition is that if you have a strong connection to your project, that makes it just so much more meaningful and much more successful too, I think, in terms of getting your message out or, your idea out. And if you connect with your work so strongly, the audience will feel that too. So I think it's really an important part of the process. And through this exhibition, I definitely can see that happening, and that really informs me. I think as I go on, I will delve deeper into kind of what, I really want to say with my work. Before, it was really about making stuff that made me feel good. It was photography for me was rehabilitory. I believe that photography just has this way to bring you back to life, and it was always that way for me. If I always picked up a camera when I was feeling down, and it really just re-put me back into living again. And so I really appreciate that aspect of it. But now I also really feel that it holds a lot of power to kind of, really propel things forward, whether it's an idea or whether it's a movement. So I'm really interested in photography with social justice and activism. And so I think that's where my documentary interests lie as well.
So although the project is done because the house is no longer standing, I think the overall arching theme of my creative practice can be summed up to family, memory, and places. And so whatever spectrum that falls in, I would be continually pursuing that, whether it's documentary style or sort of a landscape type interior, or but the overarching themes are family, memory, and places. So I will continue going in that direction whenever there's an opportunity.
Yeah, no, the project isn't done. It's personal it's obviously it's personal because it's family, but it's personal for me because as a kid, I was told, my dad, I quote him a lot, but his thing was, if you feel like you need to claim that you're a man, every chance you get, chances are you're not a man. So now I disagree with that now, that as I'm at a point where I can take care of myself and okay, what does it mean to be a man? So I feel like some part of learning that isn't just from my everyday experiences, but realizing what they have gone through and how they feel about certain things, because they've encountered situations in life that maybe I may encounter sooner or later. So it's part of that is well, how do you deal with that, and how do you feel about it now? How do you feel about your decisions, and what advice do you have for me? And so because on my dad's side, there's a lot of boys in the family, I have quite a long road to go as far as talking to them all. Some of them are really hard to get a hold of. And then on my mom's side of the family, I am not very close to those people. So it's I need to talk to you to understand things with my uncle, for instance, he's got the longest lasting marriage that anybody in my family, and how have you made it work, And so that's why I don't think it's done yet. It may change form, but so far, I think that it's going to be a continual process for a while.
would say that, like the others were saying, photography is a good method of being evasive and not really showing who you are and hiding behind the things you photograph and the places you go and the people you meet and such. And this was really a first time that I really got to dive and share my own identity and what I think about my own personal photographs inside the home that relate, that also relate to spirituality, identity, and such. And when writing about this project, I struggled with trying to tell a story. I didn't really understand what that meant. I felt like each photo was its own little unique thing, something to look into. So I found the answer, in regards to writing a story through Thich Nhat Hanh, when he talks about being present, being in the moment, really living each moment to moment. And I think that my work when it comes to identity and family and storytelling is just going to continue on a moment-to-moment basis as long as I'm taking photos and have something that I want to preserve.
Questions from the audience? That's impressive. I feel like we usually have at least one. Well,
I'm wondering if any of the family members that you photographed have come to see the show and what their reactions have been, or maybe they're here today now.
I wanted to tell the story of my aunt. She is that's the photograph in the poster that you see. So this exhibit I think has been a gift because it was a doorway of a connection to her. So my aunt is immunocompromised, so she hasn't left her apartment since the pandemic started in March 2020. And I had struggled to connect with her. And so when the photograph was chosen by Jessica, or the team, and after the opening reception, I sent her the photograph. I texted it to her and I said, I'm just thinking of you. And, I had this show and they picked this as the poster and, just thought, I just want to let you know I'm thinking of you. And, that kind of opened the doorway of a connection to her. She said, and I asked her one question. I said, well, can you tell me a little bit of anything about the photograph? And so she told me that the portrait that was hanging on top of her space there, on top of the mirror, was taken by her first love, boyfriend at that time. His name is Jess. We call him Tito Jess. They were medical students, 4th year, and he was into photography apparently. And so he took the picture, processed the film, printed it, and even mounted it on this cardboard. She even remembers the kind of material it was. And they were supposed to get married. He went ahead to the States to migrate, but something happened along the way, and he just got a letter that he met someone else. And so, so all of this kind of transpired through this text, and so even if she hadn't seen the show, I think the gift was to be able to have that connection with her so far away. She's in the Philippines and isolated. So what I did was I said, Tita, that's Auntie, I'll send you the poster and frame it for you. And it so happens it was her 75th birthday. And so she was very, very grateful and just really super appreciative. So this has been a gift. Thank you.
To answer your question, no, nobody in these photos has come. My dad is, he does dialysis 3 days a week, so by the time he's done, it's too late for him to come out here. I've sent him video. Surprisingly enough, I had my younger brother who lives in Sacramento, and we don't talk often, he surprised me, just showed up on opening day. So I've had family come. My little sister came. She has been sort of with me every step of the way, but she hasn't seen it physically. So that was kind of cool to have family actually you tell people about these projects and these things that you're working on. And it's oh yeah, that sounds cool. until they see it on the wall, and you're like, oh, so I've had only a handful of family members come, which is nice.
My mom and my sisters are here in the crowd, so they're here. It's been quite a struggle to get them on my side in terms of pursuing photography as a thing to do seriously for money and such. But they seem to be happy with it, and we share the understanding that there is a use for photos, there is a use for documentary, preserving things, sharing them with other people as well. And I remember being at home and I told my mom that I'm going to use a photo of her and my grandma in the show. And she laughed and she was like, they're going to know who I am, because she works here in Oakland. So if somebody's going to be in here, they're going to recognize me. So it's nice to see them here. They've been to other shows as well, and it's nice to have the support.
Oh, gosh. Actually, my parents have not come out yet. They've been struggling with some health issues, so they were going to try to come tomorrow. They're very like procrastinator-y type people, so that's okay. I definitely understand. They do know what I do, but they don't. I think that they have this idea, like you tell them I'm working on a project, and they're like, yeah, that sounds great, congratulations, So I don't expect too much, but my sister-in-law did come out, and my brother is coming out on Saturday, tomorrow. But they do know, my sister-in-law and my brother definitely have been big supporters of me, and just trying to, they're very encouraging. My parents are old school. They don't, they support what I do, but they don't fully grasp the power of photography, I think, or being an artist. And that's okay. I accepted that. And they support me in other ways of just, being my parents, and that's enough for me.
Not the best.
I'm really honored to say that all of the people who are in my series have come out to see it, and it's been really nice because for most of them I haven't talked to them since for a few years, since this was taken before the pandemic, and then actually when my mom passed, I kind of didn't talk to anybody. So this has been a really great way to reconnect with people who had a big impact on my life and were meaningful. And as far as my mom's portrait, this exhibition has brought a lot of my family members to it. I don't think they would come out if my mom wasn't in it, but just kidding. I'm not assuming, but it doesn't matter because they did come out, and they they heard they see the portrait, and it was a way for us to connect and to remember her, and so that was really great for me. And then also the picture that I have so many pictures of my mom and my family, and I think for myself and for my family who came out here, it was really impactful for them to hear her voice again, and for the first time in many years. And it only makes me wish that I had more audio of her. So, yeah.
Any other questions from the audience?
I hope you stick with it. You, yes, you. I feel like you're onto something very complicated and very difficult, and not particularly pictorial. Well, this is always a complicated and interesting thing for a photographer to take on, the non-pictorial. But also, when you talk about longevity of relation, my own experience, not authoritative, but my own experience is it's a confluence of damage. In other words, I happen to have a very long-standing relationship with some marriage that survived a whole pilot ship. And I think it was a well-aligned pieces of damage, frankly. And this may not be a rule, but it's very interesting. And to the degree photography gives you entree to these people, whether they're family members or not, and they're willing to expose anything about their relations or their needs, which is more typical what's going on. You know, what do you need here? I think you're onto something, and I hope you keep the pedal to the metal.
All right, well, thank you all for sharing the photos and being vulnerable in front of a group of 20, 30 people. I know that's very hard, especially for photographers. I think talking about your work is probably one of the hardest things I think people have to do. And thank you all for coming. We'll be open till 9, so please stick around, listen to some of the audio, talk to some of the artists, and hang out.